And I would go back and forth from this vision, from this experience that was visceral, that was physical, that was impactful, where I felt complete peace. And then I would be back in the emergency room where there's chaos and noise and so much fear and so much anxiety and so much dread about what had happened to Carrie and David. And I went back and forth a few times, but I spent some time with Jesus in that moment, and he gave me peace. And it was so real. It was so beautiful. It was so impactful. It's a place I can still visit today. Welcome to the Light the Day podcast, where we explore spiritually transformative experiences. Today, I have a surprise for you. Today, I'm the guest on the show. Today, I'm going to share with you my spiritually transformative experience. And I'm going to start from the beginning. I had many spiritual experiences as a child, and those experiences were framed within religion. I believed in the Holy Ghost. I believed in a God. I believed in spirit fully. And I had some great experiences. I used to feel like when I was a kid, I used to feel like there was always someone following me, which was great during the day, but at night not so great. But in my 20s, I had this experience where I woke up in the middle of the night in a full-on conversation with spirit. I had been reading a book about a woman who was an entrepreneur, and the in her story, she told about how she would get up really early in the morning before people would come into work, and that's where she received a lot of inspiration and where she received a lot of it just really helped her in her journey. And as I was reading that book, I woke up in the middle of the night and Spirit said to me, "You're supposed to be getting up early in the morning too." And I was like, "What?" I thought, well, I already get up early. I have little kids. I had a 2-year-old and a baby at the time. And Spirit said, "Well, there's something else you're supposed to be doing." So I was like, "Well, what's that?" Well, in my church, there was an early morning class for teenagers, and Spirit said, "You're supposed to be teaching that class." And I said, "Oh, no, they're not going to ask me to do that. First of all, I can't do that. I have little kids." And Spirit said, "Yeah, you have little kids, but when you were in high school, your teacher had little kids too." And I thought, oh, yeah, that's true. And so I said, well, they're not going to ask me to do that. I thought, oh, that's my surefire way to get out of this conversation is to just say they're not going to ask me to do that because I knew they wouldn't, because I did have little kids and other circumstances. And that's when Spirit shocked me and said, "You're supposed to tell them." Now, in my particular church, you didn't go and tell leadership what you were going to do. You waited for them to ask you. And I was shocked by that response from Spirit. But I knew there was just a conviction in me that this was true. So I woke up my husband at the time and I said, "You're not going to believe this conversation I just had. I don't believe it. I'm not sure what this is." But that next Sunday, when I ran into our pastor, our bishop, and I said to him, I asked him if they had found a teacher for this class. And as soon as I said that, he said, "I knew it." And that's how I became the teacher of this high school class, which I did for many months. And it was a real blessing for me because in that particular responsibility, I was studying all the time, studying the Bible, studying scripture, and I felt really I developed even a closer experience with the Spirit. And that was a real blessing for me because not long after that, my my marriage ended. And this was just after my brother had passed away. So during all of this, there was a lot of things that happened. My brother died by suicide, and that was super hard and painful. It was a real grieving period for me. And then a couple of years later, my marriage ended in divorce. But during that divorce, I had so many remarkable things. And I talk a lot about these experiences in my book, Miracles in the Darkness. But I felt so led by spirit. I felt so taken care of. Before I even knew I needed a job, I had a friend reach out and said, "Are you available? We would love for you to come work for us just for a period of time. And we're going through some expansion. We need somebody to come in that has some knowledge of insurance." And that position that I took on a temporary basis ended up being a career for me and ended up being a tremendous blessing and a real growing experience for me. And during that time that I worked there, I divorced my first husband. I remarried and had another baby. So there was a lot that happened during that time, and that job was just a tremendous heaven sent, God sent experience. And I was able to take care of myself and my kids during the time that I was single and not have to be stressed about, there was a lot of stresses anyway, going through a divorce, as you can just imagine. But I did remarry, and I had three more children. I had three children from my first marriage, and then Ron and I ended up having three more children. We've been married now for 31 years, going on 32. So I think it was a success. But a few years after we married, we had three kids. Our oldest was 12, and then we had our son was 12, and then we had a daughter who was 10, and another son who was 8. And we were raising all six of the children together. But on Mother's Day in 2007, I was with my younger kids because the older kids all had school and work and obligations, so they couldn't go on this trip with us. But my three younger children and I set out on a trip across several states to go visit grandparents in North Carolina. And it was Mother's Day. It was 2007. And on that day, if you're even a little bit familiar with my story, you may know that I was in a rollover car accident. I fell asleep at the wheel, and we were in a rollover car accident that threw my son, my 8-year-old son David, out of the car, and my 10-year-old daughter out of the car, and they both passed away that day. But there were some amazing, miraculous things that happened even within that accident, even before the accident happened. Again, I talk about some of these things in my book, Miracles in the Darkness. But there was just this sense of dread before I went on this trip. There was this sense that something not so good was going to happen, but also I had gone to a funeral for a young woman who had passed away, and I had some really unusual impressions. I was like, I don't know where this is coming from. They felt inspired, but there was just this lingering dread that I experienced before the accident. Of course, after the accident, I felt like that was initially after the accident, I felt like that dread was telling me that something bad was going to happen and that I wasn't supposed to go on the trip. And so then that added to the guilt that I felt in being the driver of the car that day when my children passed away. Over time, I came to realize that it was my soul knowing that Carrie and David, that it was their time. They had actually 2 years, sorry, 5 years before, 5 years before that accident, they had fallen out of our second floor window onto the pool deck in this freak accident where they were leaning on the screen and had fallen out the second floor window together at the same time. They had very minor injuries. David had really no injuries to speak of, and Carrie had minor fractures in both of her wrists. So after a month, she was healed and everyone was fine. But that was just such a freak accident. And here we are 5 years later, and they passed away in this rollover car accident. And I really feel like that first experience 5 years before was maybe a little bit of a warning. It could have even been an exit point for them that they chose not to take. But um, I do believe in the soul plan. And so over time, I began to realize that this was in our soul plan. And that's why I had felt so much heaviness leading up to the accident. But on the day of the accident, I want to tell you some of the uh, miraculous things that happened. First of all, while the car was rolling, I heard a voice in my head tell me to bring my arm in. Now, I was familiar with voices in my head. I was familiar with spirit talking to me, but somehow in the middle of this crazy rolling car, I had the presence of mind to bring my arm in. And just 3 months later, I learned of a woman who had lost her arm in a rollover accident. And a couple of years after that, I learned of another woman who had lost her arm in a rollover accident. So I really feel like um, listening to that voice made a difference and it helped me to save my arm. So in my mind, I'm thinking, if I hear this voice that told me to bring my arm in, why couldn't this voice have shown up 5 minutes before and said you're getting sleepy? Because I never even felt sleepy that day. So that was the first thing that I recall was it was just having that impression to bring my arm in and saving my arm in that experience. The next thing that happened was while I was laying in the hospital. So at the time of the accident, two ambulances showed up. One ambulance took and actually, I'm not real clear on how all this happened, but there were ambulances there, and my son and my daughter, who had been thrown from the car, were taken to one hospital, and my other son, my older son, my 12-year-old son, and I were taken, and me were taken to another hospital, and I was laying in the hospital on a striker board, obviously in complete panic, wondering what had happened to Carrie and David, asking for updates, and nobody would tell me anything. But while I laid there, Jesus was there. And I experienced this vision of Jesus, and he transported me into this field of wildflowers. And this field was in a small valley. All the way around us were large mountains, like the Rocky Mountains, with snow, that little bit of snow on top of the mountains. But the grass was green and beautiful, and there was these beautiful um, delicate flowers throughout this field. It was just such a beautiful, peaceful scene. I was very aware of where I was, of what I was seeing, but my attention was on Jesus as he looked at me. And he took me by my hands and he didn't say anything, but he gave me so much peace. And I just felt so much peace. It was like he was transmuting peace into me. And I would go back and forth from this vision, from this experience that was visceral, that was physical, that was impactful, where I felt complete peace. And then I would be back in the emergency room where there's chaos and noise and so much fear and so much anxiety and so much dread about what had happened to Carrie and David. And I went back and forth a few times, but I spent some time with Jesus in that moment, and he gave me peace. And it was so real. It was so beautiful. It was so impactful. It's a place I can still visit today in meditation when I get quiet, and I can feel that peace. I can feel that like physical sense of peace when I go in back into that place. That evening, after I had found out that Carrie and David had died, I was laying in my hospital bed, and I had again this overwhelming sense of peace come over me. And I had this overwhelming sense that Carrie and David were okay. that they were well taken care of. They were on the other side. They were happy. They were okay. Even though I wasn't okay, even though my family was in crisis, I had this complete understanding that they were okay and that they were at peace. And at the same time that that was communicated to me, I heard again, again, it came across as a message, as a vocal message, as telepathy is the only way I know how to explain it, but it was just this, don't worry about what others say. Such an unusual message on that day. On that day, when my kids had died, I received this very clear message that I was not to worry about what other people said about the accident, what other people said about my loss, what other people said in general. I was not to worry about that. And that, again, was such a beautiful blessing for me over the next several months. There were so many miracles that were associated with that horrific experience of losing my kids. 5 months later, after the accident, I walked into a local drugstore and they were putting costumes out because by this time it was end of September, beginning of October, and Halloween was right around the corner. So they were putting these Halloween costumes out. And when I walked into this drugstore, I saw this flowy witch's costume that was right about my daughter's size. And I thought, Carrie would love that costume. But what happened right after that? Immediately, immediately, the pain of her not being here, of the loss that we experienced, the fact that she had died, hit me like 1,000 bricks. And in that moment, I said in my head, why did this have to happen? And Spirit answered me. And Spirit said, they are right where they are supposed to be. Well, that was an unusual response, but I accepted that response and I thought, okay, I had that confirmation that they were okay, that they were at peace. So this message that they were right where they were supposed to be was quite interesting. So my next thought in my head was, as I talked to Spirit in my head, and I said, why did it have to happen this way? Remember, I was driving the car. I was dealing with so much pain, so much shame, so much guilt that it was completely overwhelming. I had complicated grief. I had PTSD. I was not doing well. So I asked, why did it have to happen this way? And Spirit answered, how would you have liked it to happen? And in that moment, my mind went to answer the question because that's what our mind does. And I realized there was no good answer to that question. No good way for me to have lost my precious 8-year-old son and my beautiful 10-year-old daughter. There was no good answer. But that conversation stayed with me. And I realized within that conversation, they're right where they're supposed to be was confirmation that they were right where they were supposed to be, that this was the plan, that this was the experience that we had agreed on before we came. I believe in the soul plan. I have had it confirmed to me over and over again. Within that conversation was the confirmation that Carrie and David were okay, that this was planned, that even the hope of healing was within that conversation. And because of my experience of losing my brother and going through this just horrific, painful divorce, I had a sense that healing was possible because I had healed from those experiences. But of course, losing my kids was a whole different thing. Losing my kids was a grief experience beyond any grief that I had felt before. But I held on to a little bit of hope that that might happen. Although over the next, the 3 years after the accident, the pain of that loss, the guilt, the shame buried me and buried me under tremendous grief, under tremendous despair. And 3 years, almost to the day, I had I had someone offer to pray over me, and I took them up on that offer. And on that day, almost 3 years to the date of the accident, this person and my husband prayed over me, and the lights started to lift. Before that prayer, the darkness was so tangible. It was physically within me. I could just feel this darkness. And after that prayer, the lights started to come on. The darkness dissipated. Within 24 hours, I felt happy again. I felt peaceful again. I felt alive and like I had not felt in years. It was truly a miracle. And my connection to spirit just continued to expand, and life got better and better. I like to say that I was asleep before the accident, I died at the accident, and then I awoke 3 years later. A couple of years after this miraculous healing that I had from my grief, I met someone who was who had had his own challenges, and through his challenges, he had learned to help other people. He had learned to take his experiences with those challenges and turn around and help other people who were experiencing the same types of mental illness that he had experienced, that he had found ways to overcome to transform his life. Well, when I met him and he shared his remarkable story with me, somebody in our group turned to me and said, Julie, tell him your story. And was just, I was flabbergasted. I thought, I cannot tell that horrific story of losing my children. That I was not used to it at that time. Now I've told it 100 times, and I've told the miracle of waking up into the light again, and that experience that was remarkable. But when I was asked to do that 2 years after my healing, I very timidly just squeaked out, that I had been in a car accident and my kids had died, and 3 years later I had felt this miraculous healing, and that I had experienced this awakening. Well, as we were leaving this event, this man caught me by the arm and he looked me in the eye and he said, "You're supposed to do something with this." And when he said that, it was as if lightning hit my body. My soul lit up in recognition that it was true. It could not, I often say, and it probably could be, but I often say that it couldn't have been more plain that what I was being told was true if God had stood before me himself and said, Julie, you're supposed to do something with this. I felt it in every cell of my body. And then I had to figure out what that was, because this same man said, I don't know what that looks like, but you're supposed to do something with this. A couple years later, I was working with a beautiful intuitive, and she turned to me and said almost the exact same thing. You're supposed to do something with this. And I knew I was, and I went looking and I went looking, and eventually that turned into the grief healing program that I developed, um, coaching clients who have gone through grief of all kinds, and training coaches in grief so that they have that specialty and that understanding of what it's like to go through grief, and have a program that they can offer to their clients. That was a beautiful, wonderful thing to be able to develop that program. As I was working with as a coach, there's a few things that happened. One is I started seeing 12s everywhere. It became so they were all over the place, so much so that I knew it could be an accident. Someone was trying to communicate with me. Someone from the other side was trying to communicate with me. And in my search for what all those 12s meant, I began to learn about angels. I began to learn about spirit communication. I learned about angel numbers. I learned to communicate with the other side. I had been journaling, and I didn't even think about this until more recently, but I had been doing intuitive journaling since 2010. After my healing, a month after my healing, I started writing in a journal. I would write questions and I would write answers. I would write the answers that I received. And this turned into heavenly downloads, angel messages. In 2020, a friend's son passed away. He was in his late 20s. It was in the middle of all the chaos of the pandemic. And when he passed away, I was really concerned about my friend. We lived far apart from each other, but I remember being very concerned about my friend and having her family really in my heart, just really feeling that sadness for them, having lost a child myself. I felt it deeply. And one day, a couple of weeks after he passed away, I was getting in my car. I was just running errands. I was getting in my car. And when I got in my car, I felt something so direct. I felt her son in the car with me. But what am I supposed to do with this? I thought, I don't know what to do with this, but it was so obvious to me that it was his spirit in the car with me. So I didn't know what to do. I pulled out my phone and I just started writing what I was feeling and hearing. And I wrote down this message. And later I was able to share it with her. Even before that happened, when I was working with clients who had lost a family member, a loved one of some kind, I would frequently feel that person in the room with us. I would have a client sitting across the screen from me talking about how guilty they felt about what had happened with their loved one, and I would feel their person in my ear. And often they were in my ear saying, I don't want her to feel guilty. It's not her fault that this happened. But I was feeling their presence. I didn't know what to do with that. I really didn't. I didn't know what to do with this sudden happening of feeling my friend's son with me. This continued to happen, and I started receiving messages from loved ones of people who I had worked with, and they would give me messages, and I would reach out to the person. And I would say, okay, this might sound a little odd, but I have a message. Your dad was here, your daughter was here, your son was here. They have a message for you. And I would share those messages, if they were open to that, and everybody was. So I would share those messages. But I didn't know what to do with that. So I began studying mediumship. So if you've been watching the episodes of this podcast, you will notice that I interviewed Kelly Vicario, who is my mediumship teacher. I interviewed my friend Lisa Dyshik, who is a friend of mine in my mediumship class. So you'll see that we've kind of talked a little bit about that, but that has been an amazing experience to study that. My concern with receiving these spirit messages was I did not want to do any harm. I wanted to learn about this and figure this out, like what is happening to me. And now I practice it, and I have the most amazing, miraculous things happen. I was doing a reading for a woman last year. And when I do this, I just tell people, the person sitting across from me, I just say, just answer yes, no, or maybe. I don't want them telling me about their people on the other side. I don't want them feeding me information. So I get very little information. Basically I know their name. I was doing a reading for a woman, and I started telling her about this woman that was there with me. The way I experience is they often show up on this right side. So if you see me doing this, that's why they show up on this right side, and usually they show up where I can see their facial features or their hair color, or whether they're large or small, tall or short. I just get these impressions. I see some appearance, and I start feeling some things. Anyway, this particular reading, this woman showed up, and I saw her, that she looked a lot like that they could have been sisters, that she was the same age as the person that I was talking to, that she had similar hair color, that they were similar height. She showed me the two of them standing in a picture with their arms around each other, and they basically look like twins. I told this woman, I said, okay, so this, I feel like she was a sister to you, but she wasn't blood related to you. I told her that you guys didn't live close to each other. You didn't live in the same town, but when you would come to visit, you loved to go boating together. And then this woman in spirit showed me sandals, and she showed me these sandals, and I said, she's showing me these leather sandals, and she's showing me this jewelry. Anyway, all these things were coming through. I Where she lived, memories that they had had together, experiences that they had had together. When I finished, the woman that I was reading for said to me, "You very clearly described my sister-in-law. We were like sisters. We looked similar. She had uh, she had a pair of sandals that I admired, and when I admired them, she gave them to me. She had some jewelry that she gave to me. But my sister-in-law is in hospice. She has been very ill for a long time." So this is what she told me. Later that day, I received an email that while we were doing this reading, this woman's mom had been trying to contact her to let her know that her sister-in-law had passed away that the night before, overnight, before we did the reading. Unbeknownst to the woman that I was reading for, her sister-in-law had passed away. She was on the other side when we did that reading. It was quite remarkable to have somebody come through that early after transitioning. Even just last week, I guess it's been about a week or so ago, I was doing a reading for someone, and her grandmother came through, and I saw her curly hair, and I saw that she was, a little chubby, and she just came through with this amazing love for her granddaughter. And she showed me some dishes. It was a very brief reading, but she started to share this message, and she said, and I was doing a reading for somebody that was in my mediumship class. So she was also studying mediumship. So this grandmother came through with this amazing love. Like, it was intense love that she brought forward for her granddaughter. And then she shared a message, and she said, you don't need to worry about explaining what you're doing. You don't need to worry about telling other people about being a medium and trying to explain it to them. You are making a difference just by doing the work that you're doing. Don't worry about explaining to people who don't understand. Well, I had no idea, but just that week, she'd had a conversation with a family member about mediumship, and this family member hadn't been very receptive to it. And then she had thought about whether or not she should share it with a parent. I had no idea that that was happening, but this was a timely, evidential message that came through from her grandmother telling her, don't worry about explaining it to other people. It's okay. As I learned more about angels and I continued to do my intuitive journaling, I started receiving these downloads, like I talked about, and they were very personal. But then the angels started bringing me messages they wanted me to share with people. I'm going to give you an example. This is a message I received last January. And when I received this message, I thought, I can't share this. It was just, for me, for whatever reason at the time, it felt uncomfortable to share this idea. But they they gave me this message and they're super loving and patient with us. I like to always say that we're like toddlers in God's eyes. We are, the spirit realm is so advanced and open and beautiful and loving and peaceful. We experience just a portion of that here. Our eyes of understanding are just open in the tiniest way. So to me, we're like toddlers. And if you've ever had a child and you know what it's like to just you lead that little toddler around and they fall and you help them back up, and that's the way that I have come to understand how spirit, how God, how angels communicate with us. So they're okay when they, give me a message that I'm not fully confident sharing initially, but I did share it eventually. I did get more confident. I did get more comfortable with the messages they were sharing with me. So let me just tell you this message that I received last January. This is a time of great awakening. You are being called out of your slumber. Awake and arise to the power within you. Awake to the possibilities that are before you. Connect to your innate intuition, for you are a being of spirit and light, and as such, you have great strength, and you have access to great strength beyond your own. You are loved. Isn't that a beautiful message? Isn't it funny that I felt hesitant to share that message initially? So I'm going to answer the questions that I ask my guests. And the first question I'm going to answer is what I do, what my spiritual practices are, and how you connect to me. Today, I read energy. I'm a healer, a medium. I'm bringing forward messages and assisting people in connecting to their higher truths, to their higher understanding, awakening within us that connection to spirit. As far as spiritual practices, some of the spiritual practices that I love is meditation. It's inspired reading and studying. It's pondering. It's it's being present. It's being present at the beauty of the world. It's in that intuitive journaling that I talked about, asking the questions, listening for the answers, and writing down those answers. I love to teach people to communicate with the other side. I love to help people connect with their loved ones on the other side, to connect to their spirit guides and their angels. That's the thing that I love to do. You can find me at juliecluff.com. There's a link below this video to the angel book. It's a brief book that I created. It's a ebook that I created, just a very short introduction to angels and how we can work with angels. Um, so yeah, visit me at juliecluff.com, and thank you for being here, listening to my spiritually transformative experience. Different than some in that it was it was this really hard thing that happened that it took me some time to integrate that experience and continue to build on those gifts that were given to me at that time. The opening of my ability to see, feel energy, to hear messages more clearly, to connect to the other side with that clear cognizance, that clear understanding. And so grateful to be here with you today, and we'll talk again soon.